Hello, my name is Lu Xun and welcome back to my channel. So recently I did a video where I talked about 30 different historical fiction books from around the world. I will leave that video linked in the cards above if you want to go and check it out. But it got me thinking about a similar video that I would like to do. So today I want to talk about 30 classics from around the world. If you've been here on my channel before, you will know that I am trying to read 30 classics before I turn 30 next year, which again I made a video about and will leave the cards above, and that I am also trying to read books from all around the world. I do a challenge every other month where I read books from different parts of the world, and again I will leave the information of that linked in the cards above. Lots in the cards today. So I thought it would be good to combine the two things and talk about books from around the world that are also classics. Now, when I did this with historical fiction, I'd say I'd read about 2/3 of the books I was talking about, maybe a little less. But this time it's definitely a lot less than 2/3 because I have far less classics knowledge than I do historical fiction, and also because I've not been as good at reading from different parts of the world when it comes to classics. Partly that's my own fault, partly that is also because from a lot of the world the classics do not get translated or have not been translated. In fact, some of the books that I have found during the research from this video, I found it very hard to find available in the UK. So the books that I'm going to talk to you about from around the world, I've read some of them, but some of them I have not read. They're just books that seem like they would be exciting to me. Now, I'm just going to say before I begin talking about the books that when I'm talking about classics, I'm going to be talking about any book that is more than 50 years old. So any book from before 1970. Obviously 1970 is now 50 years ago, but just make it easier on myself, it is 60s and before. Now, as I said at the beginning, I have 30 books to talk about, so this is going to be a whistle-stop tour of classics. So strap in and let's get talking about those books. Now, I live in the UK, I'm living in England right now, so I'm going to start with England. And for an English classic, I would recommend Persuasion by Jane Austen. Now, I know Jane Austen is, of course, one of the most famous writers to come out of England, so there's a good chance you have read some of her classics before. I think Persuasion has an interesting reputation. It is a lot of people who have read all of Jane Austen's favourites, but it is not one that people tend to start with. It is not as famous as something like Pride and Prejudice or Emma. Persuasion tells the story of Anne Elliot, a 27-year-old daughter of the landed gentry, who, because of his profligate spending, has had to move out of his house and rent it out, and that at the beginning of the novel. We also know that Anne was proposed to when she was 19 years old, but through the persuasion of people around her, the man in question was considered unsuitable because he worked in the navy and was not a gentleman. Through the machinations of the novel, this man, Captain Wentworth, comes back into Anne Elliot's life, and she moves around England as she goes to visit her sister and to the seaside and eventually to Bath, where her father and her sister have settled. This book is the most romantic of Austen's novels, I would say. There is more of a melancholy, nostalgic feeling than there are in Austen's other novels, although I would also say it is one of her sharpest social critiques, and the only novel of hers in which our heroine marries beneath her. Austen had honed her talent by the time she got round to writing Persuasion, which was her final finished novel, and it therefore has a lot more subtlety than some of the other novels. It is a slower paced book, but one that I think really deserves reading. Not going too far, a classic from Scotland that I would recommend if you are a fan of historical fiction is Waverley by Sir Walter Scott, which follows Waverley, who is the son of an English Whig and the nephew of an English Tory during the time of the Jacobite rebellions in the middle of the 18th century. He travels into Scotland as part of the English army, but befriends his Tory uncle's Scottish friends and becomes enamoured of the Scottish cause. This book is one that takes a little getting your head around because it is one of those classics that does not care if you don't speak Latin, German, French, Scots and Gaelic, but it is one that has a lot of humour. It is great if you love a battle scene, and also great if you're someone who reads a lot of historical fiction, because this is one of the earliest forms of those novels. You can see where a lot of the tropes began. Moving across to France now, and a novel that I haven't read but I've always wanted to, is The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas. It tells the story of D'Artagnan, who comes to France to join the Musketeers, only to find himself immediately duelling Athos, Porthos and Aramis, who are some of those very king's men. And when they become friends, this puts him in the path of the machinations of Cardinal Richelieu, and he also falls in love with a young, beautiful woman called Constance. This book, I know, is a ripping yarn, one of the original swashbuckling novels, and one that I think would be a lot of fun to read, which is something that you don't often associate with classics, but something that I would definitely enjoy to experience. A novel from Hungary, which is one of the latest classics on this list, and that is Katalin Street by Magda, which is from 1968. This is a slow-moving, dreamlike novel that explores the lives of three families who lived next door to each other in Hungary before the Second World War, during the German occupation, and during the time of the Soviet Union. It explores ideas of what it is like to live under fascism, of creeping terror, and of the ways that people try to hold on to a seemingly normal life, as well as the surreality of what can happen under fascism. It's a very slow-moving, close-focused book, and one that feels always slightly off-kilter, but I found it a wonderful read. And of course, it would be remiss of me not to mention Russia when talking about classics. There are lots of Russian novels I would love to read, but one of them is Anna Karenina, which is known as one of the greatest love stories of all time, and also a chunky, complicated classic. It is about a love affair between Anna Karenina and Count Vronsky, two people who are a part of Russian high society in the middle of the 19th century. This novel is a complicated weaving together of multiple different characters and really sets up the experience of what life was like in Russia at the time for those in higher society. So that is all the European books that I wanted to talk to you about, and as Russia spans Europe and Asia, I think we should move on to the Asian classics that I am excited to read. The first one on my list is in this position because my dad really loves this book and he gave me a copy of it to read a few years ago and I still haven't got round to it. And that is The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea by Yukio Mishima. It is about a band of 13-year-old boys who reject the adult world as a lying world of phonies and train themselves to be brutally callous and call it objectivity. One of the boys' mothers starts a relationship with a sailor who the boys at first idolise, but when they discover the romance, their retribution is swift and horrifying. This novel sounds like it will be quite dark. I'm getting almost Lord of the Flies overtones, but also a little bit of atonement, if you've read that book, the rejection and misunderstanding of the adult world, and it is one that I am very much drawn to. Next, a classic from India, and of course there are lots of classics from India, lots of books to choose from, but the one that I have picked is Train to Pakistan by Singh Kushwant, and the reason that I found this one so intriguing is because it is about partition in 1947 between India and Pakistan, which is an area of history that I feel like we should learn more about. Living in Britain, growing up in the British education system, where in the country that caused the partition, it seems ridiculous that I don't know more about it, and so it's something that I would like to read about. This is the story of an isolated village and a Sikh boy and a Muslim girl who are in love, and focuses on the human drama and suffering caused by the partition. The small town decides to fight for one another, but when a train full of murdered Hindus and Muslims rolls through the station, things change. It seems like it would be a very dark book, but a period of history that it is necessary to read about. Next, a book from Korea, and that is East Goes West by Younghill Kang. Japanese occupation of Korea is something that has interested me ever since I read Pachinko, and this book begins there. It is actually about a man who flees Japanese occupied Korea and ends up in the United States with only a suitcase full of Shakespeare and $4 to his name. He travels throughout the United States and Canada, witnessing the idealism, greed, and shifting values of the early 20th century United States. This one I was intrigued by because it is an outsider's perspective on the Western world, and also because it is that meeting of East and West. It is a Korean classic that has been described as uniquely and vividly realised. China, again, is a country with a lot of classics and a lot of literature to get into, but the one that I have chosen is another piece of 20th century literature because that is the one that I felt drawn to. I think reading lots of books from a similar time period but different parts of the world would be a really interesting experience. The one that I have chosen is Call to Arms by Lu Xun, which is a collection of short stories by one of China's most famous writers, including poignant satire of the Chinese national character and stories written entirely in vernacular. It's said that it exposes a contradictory legacy of cosmopolitan independence, polemical fractiousness, and anxious patriotism that continues to resonate in Chinese intellectual life today. Books that deal with nationalism and patriotism are two things that I am really intrigued by, and I know that there's an interesting legacy of Lu Xun, who is both embraced by and rejected by the Chinese Communist Party, of which he never became a member himself. Next, an Iranian novel from 1969, which is Savashun by Simin Daneshvar. Savashun is a tradition from southern Iran from pre-Islamic times that still continues. And this novel chronicles family life in Iran during World War II. World War II novels are not something that I, generally speaking, read a lot of, but I am most intrigued by them when they are from cultures other than Western ones. And this novel evokes the images of Persepolis and pre-Islamic Iran, of the great Persian poets and Sufis and nomads, as well as the influence of foreign powers and corruption. and it's told through the eyes of a young wife who copes with her idealistic husband while longing for a traditional life. It sounds like something entirely different from any of the classics that I have read before, and that is what draws me to this one. Moving now into Africa, I have read a few African classics, and one can't mention African classics without mentioning Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, which is a historical fiction account of the Igbo people in the 18th century. I'm telling the story of one man who is a powerful part of his village until his fatal flaw of hubris causes him to lose everything. It explores pre-Western contact Igbo culture, as well as the eventual contact of Europeans into the interior of Nigeria, and is full of nuance, offering no angels or demons in this book. I've also read Segu by Maurice Condé, which is a story of the Bambara people and 4 sons of Segu, the major city of Bambara. These 4 sons explore the different outcomes for the Bambara people in the 18th century. One becomes an Islamic scholar and travels to Morocco and then home again. One becomes enslaved and ends up in Brazil. Another becomes a leader of his tribe, and another a famous hunter and eventually a convert to Christianity. Maurice Condé, who wrote this novel, uses it to explore all the different outcomes of West Africa at the time and to show how those things still ripple through culture to today. Set in South Africa, I have also read Cry at the Beloved Country by Alan Paton, which is a classic about apartheid South Africa, told through the story of one priest who journeys from his rural parish into Johannesburg to find his nephew, who has been accused of a dreadful crime. The novel travels throughout Johannesburg and the rural counties, encountering many different people from different South African backgrounds, and explores the negative outcomes of prejudice and discrimination. It is a very close book with not a lot going on, but one in which there is still a lot of depth. Next, an Egyptian classic that I've heard a lot about for both its humour and satire, and that is The Magnificent Conman of Cairo by Abdul Kamel. The story is about Khaled, a spoiled and idle young man who meets Malim, a carpenter's apprentice and the son of a scoundrel. And a plot ensues that ends up with Malim thrown in jail, and we follow guilty Khaled seeking to leave the upper-class lifestyle that he found so suffocating. And both end up drawn into a commune of eccentric and failed artists living in a derelict Mamluk citadel. Adel Kamal is someone who is very respected in Egyptian literature circles, and this novel is supposed to be both poignant and entertaining. Another book that I would like to read is The River Between by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who is one of the most famous Kenyan writers of the last century. This book is also a historical novel that explores the early days of white settlement in Kenya. The Gikuyu people are torn between those who are intrigued by white custom and Christianity, and those who want to stick with their traditional ways of life. And the novel focuses on Wayaki, a visionary who wants to educate the tribe. I think that a lot of the classic post-colonial books from Africa explore this early days of white settlement, and it would be interesting to see it from a different perspective. And finally, for Africa, from Ghana, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born by Aikwe Armah. This is another book from the 1960s and is about an unnamed narrator who works at a train station and is offered a bribe but refuses to take it. The story is set around the time of the overthrow of Kenya's first democratically elected president and the coup that followed thereafter, exploring the stretch between colonialism and a strong national identity. Next, moving across to North America, there are of course lots of famous classics from the USA, but the one that I want to talk about is Hitting a Straight Lick with a Crooked Stick by Zora Neale Hurston, which is a collection of all of the extant short stories of Hurston's work. I haven't read any of her novels, although I assume that they would also be brilliant and something that I would want to read, but I really enjoyed this collection of short stories and Hurston's iconic use of African American vernacular English. Her novels are really situated in place, both in her native Florida and her chosen home of Harlem, New York. These short stories explore blackness in the early 20th century America with humour, warmth, and no fear of the darkness as well. They are stunningly beautiful books, and I think any Hurston would probably fall well on this list. And moving north to Canada, I couldn't make this list without talking about Anne of Green Gables, a series of children's books that I devoured from Canada and really made me want to visit Prince Edward Island. This tells the story of Anne, an orphan young girl who is adopted by Matthew and Marilla Cuthbert, who think they are getting a boy. We follow her life as she explores her imagination, meets friends, and goes to school. But there is always beautiful writing and extreme warmth in these books. I've not read them since I was a child, but I know I found them exceptionally comforting when I did. Next, a book from Mexico that I would love to read, and that is Cartucho by Nelly Campobello. This is apparently one of the most famous works of Mexican fiction, but not one that I have heard of myself until I started doing research for this video. And Nelly Campobello played an important part in Mexico's cultural renaissance and the political revolution of the 1920s and 30s. Cartucho is an autobiographical novel of her childhood spent among the Mexican Revolution, where Pancho Villa was a personal friend of her family. They are one of the only first-person female accounts of early 20th century Mexico, which is of course one of the reasons I was drawn to them, but the writing is also described as beautifully lyrical, which always ticks my boxes. Next, some Caribbean fiction, and The Housing Lark by Sam Selvin. Now, this is set in the UK, but it is about the generation of people from the Caribbean who were invited to the UK in the 50s and 60s because of the shortage of labour. Sam Selvin himself was a Trinidadian-born author who lived in the United Kingdom, and that connection of cultures is something that I have always been interested in reading, especially since we had the Windrush scandal in this country. It is something that I think I need to read more of. Focuses on a man who lives in Brixton, and that is also one of the things that drew me to it, being from South East London myself, and is about a group of friends who decide to save up and buy a house together. They have to face grasping landlords and the less than welcoming attitude of the mother country. From Jamaica, a classic that I think I probably have on my shelf somewhere and have been meaning to read for a long time is The Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys, which is kind of a retelling of Jane Eyre, but told from the perspective of the woman who was called Bertha in Jane Eyre, although in Wide Sargasso Sea she is known as Antoinette Cosway. And this follows her marriage to Rochester and her eventual being driven towards madness by the rumours and the abuse of her husband. This is one of the most famous works of post-colonial feminist literature, and that is why it is on my list. Next, from Cuba, we have Szabo, Gertrudis Gomez de Avellaneda, which is from Cuba in 1841, and which Gertrudis had to publish herself with her own money because at the time women were not allowed to publish books in Cuba. This is one of the earliest feminist abolitionist novels, apparently, and is about a love story between an enslaved man and his mistress, which is something that feels rather uncomfortable, but I've heard such good things about this novel whilst doing this research. Now, moving on to South America, and of course I can't mention South American classics without mentioning 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Although I discovered that Gabriel Garcia Marquez is not always considered to be the father of magical realism, as there are definitely people earlier than him using a similar technique, he is still probably the most well-known proponent and the most famous Colombian writer. 100 Years of Solitude tells the story of 7 generations of Buendia family. It's set in a small town that is a microcosm of Colombian life. This novel blends political reality and magical realism with fantasy and comedy to create a novel which is one of the most famous to come out of Latin America. As I love historical fiction and magical realism, I feel like this book is right up my street. A book that I have read from Latin America is 20 Poems of Love and a Song of Despair by Pablo Neruda, one of the most famous poets from Latin America and a Chilean politician as well. He also has Canto General and other collections of poetry that are of a more political bent, but 20 Poems of Love and a Song of Despair are a collection of course, love poetry, and they are the poems that really drew me to Neruda. I absolutely love his work. It is so simple but beautiful, so haunting and lovely, and I think if you like poetry, or even if you just want to get into poetry, Pablo Neruda is a really accessible and beautiful place to start. Next, a book that has been described as the Brazilian Lord of the Flies, and that is Captains of the Sand by Jorge Amado. And this is about a group of orphans and runaways who call themselves the Captains of the Sand, who live in the back alleys of Bahia. They pull off heists and daring do's, but the public outcry wants them captured. And so this book becomes about freedom and about colonialism in a shackled land. Amado is one of the most famous Brazilian writers, which is why he made it onto this list, and I love books that are told from a childlike perspective as well. From Venezuela now is Doña Barbara by Romulo Gallegos. And this is a book about the clash between civilization and the natural world, so a theme that I always enjoy in classic novels. And it also mixes the use of vernacular Spanish, which is going to always be an interesting challenge when you're reading it in translation to see how that is evoked. It is a close psychological novel that really explores the inner workings of its characters' minds, which is something that, again, I always enjoy in a novel. From Peru, we have The Greenhouse by Mario Vargas Llosa, which is a book set over a period of 40 years from the 1920s to the 1960s in Peru. and split between two settings, a small coastal town and the Peruvian jungle. This is another experimental novel told through impressionistic prose without paragraph breaks. I think that a lot of the Latin American writers that have become famous in the English-speaking world have done a lot of experimentation with form, which is always something that I enjoy reading in a novel and what has drawn me to these books. He also tells the story non-chronologically, which I always think is a great way to explore a mystery. And finally, an Argentinian novel by Jorge Luis Borges, The Labyrinth, which is a collection of short stories and essays from one of Latin America's most famous writers. And these are tales of magic, mystery and murder, 3 M's that will always draw me into a book. And it has been described as playful and disturbing, scholarly and seductive, with haunting and utterly distinctive voice. He has a reasonable claim, along with Kafka and Joyce, to be one of the most influential writers of the 20th century. I think, for me, I always enjoy reading writers who are considered influential, because you can see the way that their works have affected other works that you read. That was a long video, but I hope you enjoyed it. Those are 30 classics from around the world that I either have read and recommend, or I'm really interested in reading. If you have read any of them, please do let me know down in the comments below. I would love to hear your thoughts. And if you have any from other countries that I haven't mentioned, again, I would also love to hear any of the books from before 1970 that you love. Thank you for watching, and I will see you again in another video. I put out videos every Thursday and Sunday, so I will be back again very soon. Please remember to like this video if you did, and thank you for watching. Bye bye!